Hey gamers, this is John, host of Video Games in the World. Today is the first day of December, which means in a few days it's the premiere of Star Wars: The Last Jedi, and for so long I have been waiting for this movie to finally come to the big screen. In honor of this new movie, our topic today in the mid-season finale of Video Games in the World is Star Wars in video games. We have all loved Star Wars since its first movie, which has become a cult phenomenon, spawning a very successful franchise which brought toys, comics, literature, video games, and tons of other merchandise. George Lucas created something great in the time it was first released. The first three movies were a success, as well as the prequels despite not getting much respect. Let us begin the episode of Star Wars history in video games. May the Force be with you. What inspired George Lucas to create such an epic franchise? Well, the 1958 Japanese film The Hidden Fortress, directed by Akira Kurosawa, was a major inspiration. Lucas has said that the movie influenced him to tell the story of Star Wars from the viewpoint of the humble droids rather than a major player. It also played a role in the conception of Darth Vader, whose trademark black helmet intentionally resembles a samurai helmet. Other inspirations beside The Hidden Fortress were the Flash Gordon movie serials from the 1930s and Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Despite the plot changes, the Star Wars films are still bursting with influences from the Flash Gordon movie serials, including the Rebels versus the Imperial Forces, Cloud City, and even the famous Roll-Up, which begins the movie. Not to mention that other Japanese films such as Yojimbo and Tsubaki Sanjuro were also part of his inspirations to create Star Wars. Not to forget that also J.R.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, was another major influence. Lucas learned from Tolkien how to handle the delicate stuff of myth. Tolkien wrote that myth and fairy tales seemed to be the best way to communicate morality, hints for choosing between right and wrong, and in fact that may be their primary purpose. Lucas has also acknowledged in interviews that the Gandalf and the Witch King characters in Lord of the Rings influenced Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader characters, respectively. It took a lot of time and money to create this film, but in the end, it became a massive success, being shown in movie theaters a month after the release of the first film. The first Star Wars movie spawned two sequels, Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, not to mention that it spawned toys, video games, novels, comics, and ton of other franchise. Before the prequels, we had the expanded universe of Star Wars, which spawned novels, comics, and video games. In terms of video games, comics, and novels, there were stories like Dark Forces, which shows how the plans of the Death Star were obtained by Kyle Katarn before Episode 4. Rogue Squadron bridged the gap between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, and Shadows of the Empire bridges the gap between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. The first prequel was released in 1999, Star Wars Episode I: The Phantom Menace. Not too many people know why it gets so much hate. Maybe it's because of the way it was written or directed. Episode II: Attack of the Clones was released in 2002, although it still wasn't much of a success but loved in many ways. Revenge of the Sith was released 12 years ago and is considered to be the best of the prequels. A decade later, The Force Awakens was released, and with a teaser which featured Han Solo saying, "Chewie, we're home." It's exactly what many Star Wars fans felt. We were all home. A year later, Rogue One was released, and this month we have The Last Jedi. Many fans, however, expressed utter disappointment at how the expanded universe was decanonized after Disney took over the franchise. What people love about Star Wars is not just the starships and political references, but also the battles, the story that can get to your feels, biblical references, the samurai-style sword fighting, the fun, the music, and the magic of a franchise that spans across the ages. Since 1983, there have been over 120 Star Wars video games. However, the role of Star Wars in gaming began with the video game Empire Strikes Back on the Atari 2600 by Parker Brothers. In this game version of the movie, players drove a snowspeeder during the Battle of Hoth, destroying AT-AT walkers. While simplistic, the game captured the essence of the movie as well as technology allowed. Several other games appeared, like Return of the Jedi Death Star Battle in 1982, where the player controlled the Millennium Falcon in a mission to destroy the second Death Star, and Jedi Arena in 1983, the first game to attempt to simulate a lightsaber battle. In this case, clearly inspired by the scene in A New Hope where Luke Skywalker trains with a Seeker. Also, in 1983, Star Wars was released based on A New Hope. In this game, the player takes on the role of Luke Skywalker towards the end of the film, in which Luke battles through many TIE fighters in an attempt to destroy the first Death Star, which was one of the best scenes in the movie. Unfortunately, because of the video game crash of 1983, there were no further Star Wars games developed until 1991. 8 years after the crash of '83, Star Wars came back to the video game consoles. A New Hope was released on the Game Boy and the NES as a platformer video game. In 1992, Empire Strikes Back returned the same video game engine used in the previous title. In 1992, Super Star Wars was released on the Super NES, developed by LucasArts and published by JVC. Super Star Wars is mainly based on Star Wars Episode IV: A New Hope, and it is the first of 3 Super NES games based on the trilogy that was made by George Lucas. The Super NES version of the Star Wars games is considered to be the superior to the NES, Sega Genesis, Game Boy, and Game Gear versions. In this game, players can take the role of Luke Skywalker, in which he wields a blaster and a lightsaber. Players can also play as Han Solo as well as his Wookiee partner, Chewbacca. There are other blaster upgrades, extra lives, and other sub-weapons. The bosses, however, can be tough. Players can also pilot the Sandspeeder and the X-Wing, fighting many TIE fighters at the Death Star. The final stage is the Death Star Trench, where you face off against Vader's TIE fighter and destroy the space base like in that iconic moment in the movie. A year later, Super Empire Strikes Back was released. The game was developed by LucasArts and Sculpture Software and also published by JVC. In its release version, it was published by THQ. Originally released on June 1, 1993 on the Super Nintendo, and 16 years later on a Virtual Console on August 24, 2009. This game featured Mode 7 graphics as well as a new gameplay features for Luke Skywalker. The game follows the story of Empire Strikes Back, where Luke seeks to train under Yoda while the rebels continue a hard battle against the Empire. In this game, Luke can obtain force powers in Dagobah. These force powers include healing, levitation, slowing down, freezing, and so on. Hard boss battles include the Dagobah creature as well as Darth Vader. You can pilot the Millennium Falcon in the asteroid field, the Snowspeeder in Hoth to take down Imperial walkers, and the X-Wing in Cloud City. In this game, you can play as Luke, Chewie, and Han once more. The final Super Star Wars game was released a year later, Super Return of the Jedi, which follows the final movie of the original trilogy, developed and published by the same companies as well as using Mode 7 graphics once again. The gameplay is very similar to its predecessor, and it has the same mechanics, password system, and Mode 7 graphics during vehicle sequences. Luke Skywalker has Jedi powers such as Saber Throw and many more, but he does not have 9 powers but 5, and it is easier for him to recharge his abilities. Han, Chewbacca, Leia in Bush's slave and rebel uniforms, and Wicket the Ewok are playable as well. Han and Chewie have their blasters, while Leia fights using her staff in Bosch. In Slave, she carries a whip, while as a rebel, she wields a blaster. But Nintendo and Sega were not the only ones with Star Wars games. There were also other games on PC, such as Star Wars X-Wing in 1993. It returns to the space fighter combat gameplay not seen since the Atari arcade games. Players generally played as a pilot for the Rebel Alliance, completing a variety of goals, culminating in the destruction of the Death Star. This game had sequels in the form of Star Wars TIE Fighter and Star Wars X-Wing Alliance. The longest running series of computer games is the groundbreaking Dark Forces series. This first-person shooter series began in 1995 with its Star Wars Dark Forces. The next in the series was Star Wars Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2, which allowed the player to play as a Jedi. The third game in the Dark Forces series, Star Wars Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast, focused more on a third-person Jedi adventure than the previous games. And the fourth and latest release of Star Wars Jedi Knight, Jedi Academy, which originated as an expansion pack for Jedi Outcast but evolved into a game of its own. Also on PC and Nintendo 64 was Star Wars Shadows of the Empire. The story of the game bridged the gap between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. In this game, you can play as Dash Rendar, a bounty hunter who becomes involved in the rebellion's fight against the Empire. You can also pilot his ship, the Outrider, as well as these sandbikes as well. The main antagonist is Pring Shizor, who is eager to overthrow Darth Vader and become the Emperor's newest right hand. Shizor is the leader of an organization called Black Sun, which seeks power over the galaxy. Another long-running video game series began with Star Wars Rogue Squadron for the Nintendo 64 and continued in Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader and Rogue Squadron 3 Rebel Strike for the Nintendo GameCube. The first title was also available for PCs, and all were developed by Factor 5 and published by LucasArts. Rogue Squadron 3 featured emulated versions of the original Atari Star Wars arcade video games. We all remember the three prequels of Star Wars such as The Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, and Revenge of the Sith. Although Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones didn't get so much respect from many, at least, they have their fans and their followers. But of course, the three prequels have their video game versions as well as games and TV shows that had expanded storylines bridging between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. We all remember how the 2003 short episodes of Clone Wars were very popular and in many ways redeemed Episode 2. The 2008 series started slow, but it got better over time. But unfortunately, Cartoon Network canceled it in 2013 and Netflix took it in 2014. But enough of that, we have to get on. So the prequel trilogy had various video games. With the release of The Phantom Menace, it has various video games adaptations such as The Phantom Menace for the PS1 and PC. In this game, people would say that play as Padme, Obi-Wan Kenobi, his master Qui-Gon Jinn, and Captain Panaka. If the player is playing as either of the two Jedi, they can use a lightsaber or execute a force push in addition to using blasters, proton missile launchers, and explosives, which are available for Amidala and Panaka. The player may also encounter and interact with other non-player characters. Throughout the game, the player will be fighting against Darth Maul, Trade Federation battle droids, AATs, Tusken Raiders, etc. Episode 1 also had the racing video game Star Wars Episode 1 Racer for the Nintendo 64, Game Boy Color, and PC. In this game, you could play as Anakin Skywalker on his pod racer and various other pilots as well. This also includes the Boonta Raceway from the movie. There were other expanded storylines in gaming of Episode 1 such as Jedi Power Battles and Battle for Naboo. Unfortunately, they were not as successful. The first strategic game in the Star Wars Expanded Universe was titled Star Wars Rebellion and broke new ground that it incorporated ships and planets not found in the original canon, such as the Rebel Assault Frigate and the Bulwark Cruiser. But for all its groundbreaking new looks, it was not as successful as would have been hoped. The second strategic title, Star Wars Force Commander, was also released, but failed to keep up with other RTS games, since it was more focused on battling, and used a primitive 3D engine. About a decade later, resource gathering lost popularity in favor of faster-paced combat-centric RTS games. In 2002, when Attack of the Clones premiered, it also had a video game adaptation on the Game Boy Advance, but the game received a negative reception due to poor gameplay, poor graphics, and simple difficulty. But some expanded storylines of Attack of the Clones met with success, while others didn't fare so well. The Clone Wars for the Xbox, Nintendo GameCube, and PlayStation 2 met with positive reviews. In this game, you could pilot ground and aerial vehicles as well as play as Mace Windu and Anakin Skywalker while in Jedi segments. Star Wars Racer Revenge was another racing game that was a sequel to Episode 1 Racer. It also met with positive reception, much like its predecessor. Its story is about Sebulba wanting revenge on Anakin Skywalker for beating him in the Boonta race. Star Wars Bounty Hunter serves as a prequel to Episode II, telling the story of Jango Fett. The game is played in the third person, and Jango carries a variety of weapons, including his blaster and flamethrower. Star Wars Jedi Starfighter was released, allowing the player to be a Jedi Master flying a Jedi Starfighter. A third RTS game with a much more conventional approach to the genre's norms and using the Age of Kings engine, Star Wars Galactic Battlegrounds offered a better alternative to those seeking strategy in the Star Wars universe. And finally, there's Revenge of the Sith, which had adaptations on the PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, and Game Boy Advance. The console versions of the game included an alternate ending where Anakin defeats Obi-Wan Kenobi and also a twist in it as well. The Game Boy Advance version was also very well received as it was rendered in 2D sprites and faithfully followed the story of the movie. Years later, there were crossovers of both the prequels and the original trilogy with LEGO, where the characters in all other areas and environments were rendered as LEGO figures. Not to forget that even Angry Birds jumped into the bandwagon as well. We all have seen expanded universe games from the original trilogy and the prequels, but there are other stories that were very well received, such as The Force Unleashed 1 and 2. The Force Unleashed games bridge the gap between episodes 3 and 4, where a secret apprentice of Darth Vader is taken in to be trained in the ways of the Sith and most likely overthrow Emperor Palpatine. But then, Starkiller or Galen Marek will soon realize that he is fighting for the wrong side, and then decides to join with a rebellion. At that time, Leia and others are forming the Rebel Alliance to overthrow the tyrannical empire and bring freedom to the galaxy. The second Force Unleashed video game stars a renegade clone of Starkiller where he trains as a Jedi and continues to fight alongside the Rebel Alliance. However, at the end of the game, players can choose either the light side or the dark side. In terms of gameplay, players can fight using the lightsaber and also obtain various Force powers. There are also quick time events in which players can finish off a boss, or a powerful middle boss or a lesser enemy in almost the same style as God of War. There was going to be a third game. Unfortunately, alongside Star Wars 1313, it was cancelled due to Disney purchasing LucasArts. The Old Republic series of video games is another one of the most successful long-running series of the Star Wars video games. But of course, it did not begin with the MMORPG video game The Old Republic. Instead, it began 14 years ago with the successful title Knights of the Old Republic. Knights of the Old Republic takes place almost 4,000 years before the formation of the Galactic Empire, where Darth Malak, a Dark Lord of the Sith, has unleashed a Sith armada against the Republic. The player character, as a Jedi, must venture to different planets in the galaxy in order to defeat Malak. Players choose from 3 character classes and customize their characters at the beginning of the game, and engage in rump-based combat against enemies. Through interacting with other characters and making plot decisions, the alignment system will determine whether the player's character aligns with the light or the dark side of the Force. Knights of the Old Republic 2 starts 5 years after the events of the first game and follows the story of the Exile, a Jedi Knight who was exiled from the Jedi Order. During this time, the Jedi Order has been almost completely wiped out by the Sith. The game begins with the protagonist waking up from an unconsciousness on an asteroid mining facility. After he or she escapes with help of the party members, they find the person who exiled them 10 years ago, who sends the protagonist on a mission to seek out the remaining Jedi to fight against the Sith. In 2011, Star Wars The Old Republic was released as an MMORPG video game developed by BioWare Austin and published by Electronic Arts. The story takes place in the Star Wars fictional universe shortly after the establishment of a tenuous peace between the re-emergent Sith Empire and the Galactic Republic. The game features 8 different classes. Each of the 8 classes has a 3-act storyline that progresses as the character levels up. Players join either the Republic or the Sith, but players may possess a morality at any point along the light-dark spectrum. Different classes favor different styles of gameplay, and the game features extensive customization options, fully voiced dialogue, companion characters, and dialogue options similar to BioWare's own Mass Effect series. Before the Disney era, there were 2 Battlefront video games. The Battlefront video game was first released in 2004, and it's a first third-person shooter game capable of online play where you can play in both trilogies as all factions in many different battlefields. Its sequels, Star Wars Battlefront II, Battlefront Renegade Squadron, and Battlefront Elite Squadron were released in 2005, 2007, and 2009 respectively. Consoles and handhelds that could support the game were the PlayStation 2, the Xbox, the Nintendo DS, and the PSP. After the restructuring of the canon due to Disney purchasing LucasArts, the expanded universe of the pre-Disney era were decanonized and became a saga known as Legends in April of 2014. Yeah, a lot of people who were devout fans of the expanded universe hated Disney for that and blamed the company for the cancellations of The Force Unleashed 3 and 1313. Moving forward, Disney revealed that Electronic Arts had the rights to Star Wars video games. Star Wars Battlefront, released in 2015 close to the release of The Force Awakens, is not considered canonical to the franchise due to not having a single-player campaign nor any sort of narrative, a move which was heavily criticized by fans. Entirely focused on online multiplayer, it featured movie characters Luke, Leia, Han Solo, Boba Fett, Darth Vader, and Palpatine, and planets Tatooine, Hoth, and Endor from the original trilogy. Downloadable content later added planets Jakku from The Force Awakens and Scarif from Rogue One. Star Wars Battlefront 2 is considered part of the Star Wars canon because it includes a story mode set between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens, in which the player controls a female Imperial officer named Iden Versio. The multiplayer mode features characters from the original, prequel, and sequel trilogies, as well as anthology films. All of its downloadable contents are expected to be free. There were many other games as well, like the Masters of Teräs Käsi, which is Lost in Darkness. This was a fighting game with characters like Luke, Leia, Han Solo, Chewbacca, Boba Fett, Darth Vader, Mara Jade, and so on. The Force Awakens had an adaptation of its own, but it was released as a LEGO-themed video game titled LEGO Star Wars The Force Awakens. Visceral Games was working on a Star Wars game which was being directed and written by Amy Hennig. Hennig is known for the Uncharted series of video games. In October 17, 2017, EA announced the closure of Visceral Games. EA reassigned the game to its EA Worldwide Studios led by EA Vancouver, and said they will revamp the gameplay, which had been described as a linear, story-heavy title, into a broader experience that allows for more variety and player agency. And finally, in conclusion, Star Wars continues to be iconic in the sci-fi genre, alongside other icons like Star Trek, Battlestar Galactica, and many more. Although it had great games, it had bad ones as well, just like any other video game series. Star Wars The Last Jedi will be released, and it gave me a great joy and a privilege to make this episode, since I have loved Star Wars since the age of 5. And that's all, ladies and gentlemen. Comment, share, subscribe, rate, follow me on social media, support me on Patreon, and subscribe to me on VidMe. I am John, host of Video Games in the World. May the Force be with you, gamers.